الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu to my dear brothers and sisters in Toledo at Masjid Saad. As you can see, I'm wearing my Toledo shirt here in honor of Toledo and Masjid Saad, my hometown, and my home away from home. Again, as always, I miss you. I wish I could be there with you. During any other Ramadan, I would be there on the weekends with you there at Masjid Saad, praying Taraweeh and hugging you and giving you salams. So, of course, we miss each other. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring us together again soon. So, the topic today, we're going to continue from the topic of last week. And if you missed the khatira from last week that we were able to share together, then I would suggest that you go back and listen to that one before this one. So if you're watching this live, obviously just keep going. But if you're watching it as a pre-recorded talk, then I would suggest go look at the other one first and then come back to this one. But just in case, I'm just going to give a brief summary of what we talked about last time and then continue, inshallah. So last time what we talked about was that our life, however many years that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us in our life, we should use this as an opportunity to be getting closer and closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout our lifetime. So if we find ourselves today in the same place that we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, however many years ago, then we should be concerned. We should have made some progress, inshallah. So we said, how do we make that progress if we can see around us other brothers and sisters who have made more progress and are much further down the road than we are? And we know this because we see them in salah and they're crying, or they are in a khutbah, or they're hearing about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you can tell that they're emotionally connected and there's tears running down their face or whatever it is. You can tell that they're getting much more from it than we are, and sometimes we feel our hearts are hardened to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is the difference between us and them? And we said last time that many times it's multifactorial. There may be many things. It's a difficult question to answer. And one of those things could even be that we're sinning and there's ma'asi, disobediences of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are keeping us from getting closer to Him. And that right away we should get rid of that, of course. That should be the first step. But even beyond that, if someone were to say that I want to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and I find that my heart is just not in it, I don't feel the emotional connection the way that I should to the Quran and to my prayers and reading Quran and listening to Quran and listening to lectures and whatever. So what is the answer? Now someone may say to that person, well, you just need to pray more, brother. Just make more salah. And so he makes more salah and he's still going to have the same problem. Oh, you should start fasting and fast every other day, or fast Monday and Thursday, or the white days, ayam al-Bid, then he has the same problem. Oh, you need to read more Quran, brother, or you need to read the translation so you understand it, or whatever it is. But he has the same problem. The problem is that if he doesn't feel the emotional connection from the beginning, then doing more and more of those ibadat, those worships, without the connection is not going to solve the problem. So if we don't do those ibadat with sincerity and with the connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more and more of them is not going to just magically create the connection. We have to first, before we even do those ibadat, have the sincerity in them. Then we can benefit from doing more and more. But how do we develop that sincerity? How do we develop the emotional connection to the Quran, to our salah, to recitation of the Quran, reading the Quran? How can we develop that connection if we find ourselves lacking, we find that our hearts are hardened? And this is where I'm going to share with you, as we did last time, the concept of contemplation reflection. But I'm going to share it with you this time in a way that may be different than what you've ever heard before. And I know you're skeptical. You're saying to yourselves, brother, I've been a Muslim for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. How are you going to tell me something that I've never heard before? Well, I'm going to tell it to you in a different way maybe than what you've heard before. And inshallah, I really think that if you take my advice to heart and you implement what I'm about to advise you, that it could make a difference in your life. It really could make a difference in your emotional connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So last time we talked about the concept of contemplation and reflection. And the common understanding of this, and what everybody, all of you, I'm sure, already understand, is that we need to be thinking about the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, contemplating about the universe, the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the purpose of life, why we're here, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of the aspects about Allah and all of the descriptions that we have of the Prophet ﷺ, we need to not just read about them, but we need to actually reflect upon them and have some free time, some quiet time when we actually sit there and we think about them. When we do these things, these activities, we're really softening our heart and we're opening our heart to prepare it to hear the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and feel connected to it. So if our hearts are hardened and there's a rust on our hearts, then when the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come towards our heart, they're just going to bounce off. But when we prepare our heart and we make it like a satellite dish, and we've made our heart big and ready for the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then when the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come to us, we actually are able to collect it and really feel that connection to it. So, contemplation, reflection, obviously all of us need to be doing that. And we mentioned last time the description that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave in the Quran. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. So أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, meaning, do they not contemplate the Quran? Or are there locks on their hearts? أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا, meaning that if we're not doing tadabbur, we're not doing contemplation of the Quran, then we're not giving it its due. The Quran is not just meant to be recited, read, even used in prayer. It's meant to be contemplated. We need to be contemplating the Quran. Okay, now that we've established that, we talked about that last time, now I'm going to give you the piece of advice that is potentially something new to you, something that you've not heard before. What is that? It's a different type of contemplation, different type of reflection. And the best way that I can introduce this to you is to give you an example. If I were to tell you, for example, that next week you're going to meet the Queen of England. Now pretend that the COVID situation is not here. There are actually flights going to England. It's not dangerous to go there. And the Queen of England wants to meet with you. What would you do for the next week? You would be obsessed with the idea that next week I'm meeting the Queen of England. And what am I going to wear? And what am I going to say to her? And I have to learn all of the protocols of how to stand and how to do this and do that and whatever. What is she going to be wearing? And what will she say to me? What will she even smell like? I wonder what nice perfume she might be wearing. Imagine all of these obsessive thoughts would be in your mind all the time for the next week. So let me ask you, do you ever do this with the Prophet ﷺ? Do you ever do this with Jannah? Do you ever do this with Jahannam? Do you do this with the Day of Judgment? Are these things not as real to us as this meeting with the Queen would be if I told you you were meeting her next week? Do we not know that for sure we're going to die? We're going to be placed in the ground. We are as sure of that as anything. And yet, do we think about it? Do we reflect upon it in the same way? How do I mean? Well, if you know that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His mercy, gives us Jannah, that we will, if we're counted in the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and inshallah we all will be, we will meet the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Did you ever think, what will I say to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? What will be my first words to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when I meet him? Have you ever stopped to reflect on that? Have you ever wondered, how will he smell? What will he be wearing? What will he say to me? How many people will be there at the time? Where will Abu Bakr and Umar and the other Sahaba and Fatima, where will they be? Will I be in the front of the line early to meet the Prophet ﷺ, or will I be way in the back because I wasn't even close to being one of the early people, the best of the best? Did you ever think about this? Have you ever given it reflection and thought? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in the Quran what is Jannah like, did you ever try to imagine it in your mind? Did you ever try to think, what will it be like when I step foot in Jannah? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives me Jannah, and I'm standing outside and I put my first foot inside, what will I be feeling? What will be going through my mind? What will I see first? What's the first thing I'm going to see? What's the first thing I'm going to run to do? Who's the first person I'm going to look for? Is it my mother, my grandmother, my wife? Have you ever thought about these things? Have you ever reflected and contemplated about them? And I would say that most people have not. Because these things, as real as we know they are, we don't think about them as imminently as we do what we're going to be doing tomorrow and what we're going to be doing next week. Our work and our relationship with our families and all of the different mundane things, the grocery shopping and all the other things that we need to do. we spend more time thinking about these things than the reality of Jannah and Jahannam and the Day of Judgment and the life in the qabr, in the grave. We don't spend enough time reflecting on these to make them more real to us. But the more real we make them to us by reflecting upon them and thinking about them, the more our hearts will be in tune to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we read in the Quran or we hear recited in the Quran the remembrance of the Day of Judgment or Jannah or Jahannam or the life of the grave or death. All of these things will mean more to us because they become more real in our minds and in our hearts, and so we'll feel that emotional connection to them. This is what I mean by reflection and contemplation, beyond the type that most people do and that many of us are usually doing. This is my advice to you, is to spend some time doing this type of reflection and contemplation so that these things are more real and you can benefit more from the remembrance of these things, and your hearts will be softened. You'll find your heart softened to these ideas. I'll give you just a brief example from my own life. Maybe it's silly. One time there was a piece of furniture delivered to our house that I had to put together. When I finished putting together this piece of furniture, now I was left with this box, this big, huge box. And I said, SubhanAllah, this box is exactly the same size as me. It looks like the size of a coffin. And I said, you know what? I just want to try it out. I know that someday I'm going to be dead, and I'm going to be buried, and I'm going to be put in a coffin, and people are going to pray janazah behind me. And I need to imagine that day when I'm the one at the front of the masjid, and the imam is standing beside my head and leading the Muslims in janazah for me. And so I got inside of that box. And honestly, I wish I would have kept that box. We didn't have any room in our house for it, and I'm sure my wife would have been mad at me eventually. But I wish I would have kept it and done that again. Because just that activity of imagining my own death and my own janazah, it softened my heart. And if we make these types of contemplations and reflections a daily activity, and compound upon it what we talked about before, seeing the beautiful creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and remembering all of the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, that gratitude that engenders, if we do all of these on a constant basis, that remembrance of Allah and that remembrance of all of these spiritual topics will connect us with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and will open our hearts and soften our hearts. So I encourage you to do this. Again, maybe it sounds strange, it's something you've not thought to do before, just give it a try. I have a feeling that if you just give it a try, that inshallah it will make a difference for you and you'll feel that emotional connection growing, inshallah. Keep us in your dua, keep our community in your dua, keep our masjid in your dua. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease this COVID crisis and bring us together again soon. And of course, nothing happens without the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we need to be patient during this time of the COVID crisis, and especially if we are patient during Ramadan, the time when good deeds are multiplied, then inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will multiply the reward for that patience that we have right now through this crisis. So I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts from all of us during this month of Ramadan, all of our ibadat, all of our worship, our patience, our istighfar. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.